Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jane Eisner. I'm editor of The Forward, which you could read in print every week and online at forward.com. It's my pleasure to moderate what I think is going to be a fascinating conversation tonight. Let me briefly introduce our guests to you, and then we'll get right into it. On my far left, your far right, and that I'm sure does not indicate any sort of political leaning, is Eric Alterman. Eric is a professor of English and journalism at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, and also a professor of journalism at CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism. He's the author of The Liberal Media, the column for The Nation, a fellow of the Nation Institute, and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, where he writes and edits the Think Again column. He's also a columnist on Jewish-related issues for Moment magazine and a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute in New York. And when he's not so busy, Eric has written a number of different books, appropriately for tonight, one entitled Why We're Liberals, a Political Handbook for Post-Bush America. Next to him is Michelle Goldberg. Michelle is a journalist who writes frequently about religion and politics. Her first book was a New York Times bestseller, Kingdom Coming: The Rise of Christian Nationalism. It was about religious fundamentalism in American politics. And next month, Penguin Press will publish her second book, The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World, which is about the global battle over reproductive rights. She's a member of J Street's advisory committee and a consultant on a project that I hope we'll hear more about tonight, being run by the think tank Political Research Associates. Next to Michelle is Rabbi Steve Gutow. He is the president of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. He's served for the American Jewish Congress, the Texas Civil Liberties Union, and numerous leadership roles. He founded the National Jewish Democrats Council. He served as rabbi of the Reconstructionist Minyan of St. Louis, and, if that weren't enough, an adjunct law professor at St. Louis University. And finally, to my immediate left is Jeremy Ben-Ami. Jeremy is the executive director of J Street. He came to this relatively new lobbying organization after a 25-year career in government, politics, and communications here and in Israel. He served in a number of senior government positions, including as President Bill Clinton's deputy domestic policy advisor and the policy director of Howard Dean's presidential campaign. J Street is the political arm of the pro-Israel, pro-peace movement, and we are delighted to have him and the others here. So let's start by just getting our definitions straight. We're here to talk about a liberal lobby, a liberal Israel lobby. What does that mean to each of you? How would you describe what that means? If you don't volunteer, I will call on someone.
Call on Jeremy. He's the one with the liberal Israel.
All right, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jane. We were saying backstage that I actually find the terminology of liberal incorrect, and so in a sense, I guess, as you said, I must object to the panel tonight, because I think what has characterized lobbying and advocacy when it comes to Israel in this country is an unrealism, an ideology that has looked more to the ideas and theories of what would actually make Israel secure, what would project its power, instead of the realities. And I think what was missing on the scene is a lobby that was saying to the power structure in Washington, to the Jewish community, that what is in the essential best interests of the state of Israel, what is in the best interests of the United States, and frankly what serves the American Jewish community, is an end to the conflict with the Palestinian people and an end to the conflict with the Arab nations that surround Israel. Without that, as the current Prime Minister of Israel has said, Israel as a Jewish democratic state is finished. And so if you're going to be a lobby for the principle that we want to have a resolution to this conflict, that we want America to play a leading role in that, I don't like characterizing it as a liberal or any other position. It's a realistic assessment of the future and of what Israel needs, and there hasn't been an adequate force advocating and lobbying for it. So that's what I think we've needed in this country, and I don't think it's an ideological perspective.
Do you agree, Eric, that it's not an ideological perspective?
Well, I guess I do, actually, to my own surprise. The thing about the Middle East conflict in American politics is that it doesn't really go according to ideological lines very well. So that some of the strongest supporters or critics, biggest critics of Israel, are some of the most right-wing people like Pat Buchanan and Bob Novak, and certainly Chaz Freeman is no liberal. And you can name a lot of these people. James Baker is no liberal. The whole sort of Arabist community of foreign service officers are not liberals. They're very strongly critical of Israel, but it's not from a human rights perspective or a peace perspective. And also, the word liberal is bandied about an awful lot, and it's used in many different ways. But what it means in its most basic sense, unfortunately, it actually would be a good word for Jeremy were we using it in a classical sense, which is classical liberalism is merely the rejection of knowledge that is not demonstrated to be true in one way or another. It's a rejection of royal decrees. It's a rejection of divine decrees. It's a rejection of ideological theories like the dictatorship of the proletariat or their equivalents on the right. And it's an embrace of empirical knowledge of what is knowable. So to be a liberal merely means you believe in the truth, and you're not willing to compromise on what you understand to be the truth is. And so Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were both pretty good liberals in this definition, although George Bush and the guy who's Stephen Colbert, who can't pronounce his name, who runs Iran, is not, because they both have theological views of truth. And Orthodox Jews who believe that God handed down the Torah at Sinai are not liberals, because you can't believe that the truth could come from without and be liberal. So there's a conflict in that respect. But I think that what Jeremy's saying is true in the following respect: that liberalism leads one to realism. There are certain classical liberalism. There are certain values that are associated with contemporary liberalism, more social liberalism, that have to do with peace and brotherhood and holding hands and singing Kumbaya and stuff. But that's not what liberalism is. Liberalism is looking at the situation from a rational perspective and saying that as we see the trends with regard to the future of Israel, the future of the Jewish people, they're not good. And that the policies that are proposed by those who call themselves pro-Israel but are actually supportive of a particular militarist faction in Israel are also not good. They're not leading to a good place. They haven't led us to a good place. They're the cause of many of the problems that we face. And that from a strictly realist perspective, we need to turn this boat around, both from the perspective of Israel, from the perspective of the United States, and the perspective of American Jews. It's a normative position, and it's liberal in the old-fashioned sense. It's not liberal in a sense that we're doing this because we really care about what's best for the Palestinians or even for the Israelis. We're saying it's not increasing the greater good of the world. We can discuss those latter questions in a while, but from the perspective, Jeremy's absolutely right that what J Street is offering is a realist perspective on the Middle East, as opposed to a deeply ideological perspective, which has until now has hitherto been the position of the quote-unquote pro-Israel community.
But doesn't that then imply somehow that those who might not agree with J Street, and there may be a few people in the country still who might not agree with J Street, are unrealistic, aren't being rational about the way they're assessing the situation? Steve, how would you What do you think about this kind of definition?
I don't usually go but it's kind of shocking to hear somebody say that their opinion is realistic and everyone else's apparently isn't. I think there's a lot of realities that need to be mixed together to come up with a sensible conclusion to how the Middle East should react and how Israel should react. And I think it's important. The reason that I think it's important that J Street be here is that I think that the mix of thoughts that need to be talked about, which is a very, I hate to do this in an academic sense, which we've started, in a very liberal sense, liberal idea, is that people need to be able to talk with each other. So just as I think there's plenty of room for a J Street, and I know Jeremy knows that, I think there's plenty of room for all the organizations in the center, like the ADL and AIPAC, and also there's organizations on the right, like the David Project and others. So I think it's in the milieu of actually having a sensible conversation that we, particularly we as Jews, I mean, I'm a rabbi, and I think of the Talmud, which was a place where the hugest tent ever had to be created, so that people from all different sides could talk and every opinion was actually written down. So when I think of liberal in this sense, I do think of those people who are probably going to be more inclined to have negotiations, to try to deal in a probably a more open sense with Palestinians, no matter whether or not they're perceived as, like Hamas is very authoritarian and anti-Israel and whatever they might be perceived as. So to me, liberal, it is important in this sense, because what I think J Street offers is a chance for a more whole conversation and a more whole discussion. And so that's what I think.
And Michelle, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I would like to just, on a kind of more quotidian level, or a less elevated level, obviously liberalism has, meanings that transcend the kind of current political moment. But nevertheless, the fact is that the movements that purport to speak for American Jewry don't. So right now we have groups like AIPAC, we have figures like Malcolm Homline, who, are put forward as the voice of the American Jewish community on the Middle East, who are far to the right of where most of the Jewish community is. So it's only a faction of the community is having its voice heard. So basically what you have is this kind of very distorted discussion where views that are probably held by many of the people in this room are presented in the mainstream media as if they would only be kind of espoused by some either by Patrick Buchanan or Noam Chomsky. There's just a huge gap missing in the discussion, and there's such a penalty. There's so much fear, I think, especially among people who aren't Jewish. There's so much trepidation about wading into this arena. People see what could happen to, what happens to somebody like a Chas Freeman. There's also, unfortunately, so many of the people who do go kind of gallivanting in make all kinds of mistakes or distortions, so that you have someone, like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer who get to be celebrated as the truth tellers, standing up to this, incredibly aggressive lobby, when in fact they do make many of the mistakes and generalizations and oversimplifications that their critics accuse them of. And so there's just no intelligent voice out there that can articulate clearly what everyone can see. I mean, right now, I think there's a tremendous kind of almost panic and bad faith in the Jewish community. I think people know that what's going on, that Israel is going in a direction that is terrifying. Israel is going in a direction that is kind of existentially threatening to what a lot of people believe. It's going in a direction in which kind of Zionism and liberalism will eventually become incompatible. And so there's one faction of the Jewish community that I think is reacting to this by redoubling their policing of the discourse and by, kind of making what's before all of our eyes, ever more difficult to talk about. And all that does is create taboos in which all kinds of conspiracy theories fester. And so there simply needs to be a clear voice that can articulate on not just on behalf of, but that can speak for the Jewish community and that can speak for a sense that is sympathetic to Israel, that understands the history of Israel, that understands the imperatives of Zionism, but that also understands that right now the kind of what's called the Israel lobby or the mainstream Jewish community is supporting policies that I think that most people know somewhere are just wrong.
Well, let me challenge you a little bit on that in a friendly way, but that's my job here tonight. If we were sitting here a year ago, I think that there still would have been the perception that most Jews would certainly not have supported Barack Obama. If they were Democrats, they would have supported Hillary Clinton or else. There was still, at that time, if you recall, well into the summer, a sense that this was going to be the years where Jews swung to the Republicans. Instead, we saw record numbers of Jews voting for a president who's surrounded himself by people who certainly are liberal, democratic, and certainly know Israel very well. After all, the person with the office closest to the president, as I understand it, I haven't seen it myself, is David Axelrod, whose father and grandfather fled pogroms. The office very close by, Rahm Emanuel, we all know his story, both in terms of his ties to Israel and his involvement in the Jewish community. So is this sense that somehow Jewish liberal voices aren't heard in the White House, is that really up to date? Is that realistic?
Can I just say quickly, I actually think that what you're talking about, that discussion, are Jews going to vote for Obama? To me, that was a symptom of the problem. Yeah. Of course Jews were going to vote for Obama. Of course Jews were going to vote for the Democrat. They vote for the Democrat every 4 years, and every 4 years there's a bunch of speculation that this year is going to be the year.
With all due respect, though, if polls are to believe and are to be believed, and I guess at least J Street did some, that's not the way it was going until well into August.
No, but I was going to actually correct you on this because our poll in July actually showed that Obama did have 2-to-1 support in the Jewish community in July already, and he was only 10 points at that point less than Kerry had been.
Jane,
but even 2-to-1.
You said this was the year that Jews were going to go Republican. Nobody said that. That's off the table.
Excuse me. Nobody said
Let's start with that.
They were going to go majority Republican.
You
but
said
this
it.
definitely
You said it. So let's
okay.
take that off the table. That was a misunderstanding.
I'm moderating, Eric.
But Jane,
Sorry,
Jane,
not
this
you.
is very important. This is very important. When Barack Obama became a serious candidate for the nomination, a woman who was a lawyer who was of counsel to the American Jewish Committee organized a meeting of members of staffs of Washington organizations saying, oh my God, this is a real problem. We really have to be afraid of this guy. He's got a different view of the conflict than the one we're used to. We need to do something about this, okay? The meeting was leaked in the Forward. The people who were head of these organizations had to disavow their participation in this meeting. Of course, they all participated in it, and it reflected their views. But the fact is that particular view and the articles that were written, and there's always lots of articles written every year about this kind of thing, many of it which are ginned up by neoconservative columnists, had extremely little representation in the larger Jewish community. The larger Jewish community was always going to vote for Barack Obama, and in fact, an enormous amount of that community was thrilled to be able to vote for a black man, for the symbolism. Now, it's true that there was probably more support for Hillary Clinton than Barack Obama, but it wasn't enormously so. It was statistically significant, but not statistically overwhelming. So again, I think that this was an example. This was yet another example of of what Michelle was talking about, of the unrepresentativeness of the official Jewish community with regard to what Jews actually believe, and the willingness of the media to parrot the view of the official Jews without paying any attention to what the actual Jews do. At the very same time that these polls were being published, that these stories were being written, the American Jewish Committee published its own poll that it does every 4 years of what are Jewish attitudes, and these attitudes were as liberal as any group in America, probably more than any group, with the possible exception of blacks. And again, what these polls demonstrated is that if you go and ask American Jews, 80% of which are unaffiliated with any Jewish communal life, and any Jewish organization or synagogue. There's the number of affiliated Jews is about 25%, 20-25% in this country. But if you poll American Jews, they are at odds with the people who profess to speak for them. And so you had an awful lot in the media, and you went, the reporters go to the official source, they go to the AJC, they go to the president's conference, and they say, what do you think about Barack Obama? And they say, oh, I'm really worried. Just the way that Abe Foxman says, oh, isn't it terrible that the president is trying to be even-handed about Israel? Isn't that a catastrophe? And yet these views are almost perfectly unrepresentative of the majority of the American people, which is another argument why, there are many, many arguments, but it's another argument why, even if AIPAC were a wonderful organization that played by the rules and were entirely admirable, which it isn't, we would need an organization like J Street, which more accurately represents the majority of views of American
So let me respond, because I just listen, and I could be the oldest person here. I probably am. I don't know. But I've never not seen the Jewish community be able to respond. I've never seen this hegemony and nobody can talk. And I've been doing this stuff for about 30 years. There's always been, since I was a kid on the campus with literally every left-wing position one can take and still be rational, there have been people, maybe even me at one time, yelling very desperately about the need for Israel to do X, Y, and Z, and I've seen it all along the way. I've never seen it stop, whether it be Breira or whether it be the New Jewish Agenda or whether it be Nishmat. I mean, this idea that this is new is patently not the truth I know. And the idea that the American Jewish community doesn't speak what it wants, and I am part of the establishment. I'm the president of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and we're an umbrella group over a huge number of organizations, including the ADL, and including the Reform Movement, and including the Reconstructionist Movement. I'm a Reconstructionist rabbi, including AJC. I mean, the idea that the community doesn't have a vibrant conversation just doesn't. That's not realistic. Let me finish, Michelle. I'll let you. It's not even close. That's the part. And as far as this idea that Eric has said that the organized community, the traditional community, doesn't represent the views on Israel of the Jewish community, a poll I respect very much recently, as last fall, said that 49% of the Jewish community thought that the traditional organizations did reflect their views, and 30%. 49 to 30. Oh. Well, let me tell you, a lot of people don't even know the names of organizations. So the idea that 49% would say that was surprising to me. But it's not 12% or 6%. And I can tell you, we just had our big conference in Washington, and I know that I was proud to invite Jeremy to be one of the participants to speak. So I think this is a little bit of an odd hearing I'm hearing to my left. Because it doesn't really ring true with the community that I have been a part of for quite a long time.
Jeremy.
And you're about to hear from your right as well. It's kind of like a Claude Rains moment. Whenever I hear this sort of, I'm shocked to hear that there isn't open debate in the Jewish community. I'm shocked. And members of Congress, I'm shocked to hear that they feel pressured to only, speak a certain way. I don't know, Steve. The very, very large numbers of unaffiliated American Jews, very large numbers of non-Jews, very large numbers of people involved in American politics feel that they cannot speak their mind when it comes to Israel. They are afraid.
And Jeremy, let me ask you that. How do you know that?
Particularly because we've come into the fore. The conversations that I've had with people are, thank God you're here.
And I'm sure that's true, but you said a very large majority of
No,
Jews.
I said very large number.
Very large number. So how do you know that it's a very large number? And how large is that number compared to all the other Jews in this country?
Well, I will say that the polling that we have done shows that on the issues of peace, on the issues of a two-state solution, on the question of the settlements on the West Bank, on the questions of even things like using a dangerous word like pressuring Israel, that you get 70+% support for those propositions in polls of American Jews. And those views are considered by people both in politics and the American Jewish communal organizations to be views you're not allowed to say. And so if 70 to 75% of people...
But these are people who tell you.
No, I'm saying
these
in
are
polling. In polling.
In polling that you've done or other
Yeah,
people
yeah,
have
no,
done?
polling that we have done.
That you've done. So
Well,
I
it
have to tell you
doesn't
that
discount it just because we paid for the poll.
well, I know, but you probably would
I
think
offered the
that-
Anti-Defamation League to do the poll with us, and they refused. I stayed an offer to Steve. I'll do the poll with you. I say an offer to any organization. We will co-fund a poll with anybody because we've now done it twice, and we found the exact same results pre-Gaza and post-Gaza. And there is a very solid majority of Jewish Americans who are unaffiliated, as Eric was saying, who feel very much in the pro-peace camp and understand that Israel's future and its security depend on reaching peace. And it simply isn't at the forefront of the agendas of the mainstream organizations.
Let me just stop, because this whole thing, if you say it one more time, I don't know what you think the rest of us want. They may not agree with you on everything. I mean, I think we're all pro-peace. We may have different ideas of how to get there, and if you want, even when you introduced Jeremy, you said the pro-peace, pro-Israel lobby.
That was that was how they introduced.
That's how they introduced themselves.
Exactly.
But the truth is, I've had a huge amount of time in my life committed to peace, and I'm not convinced that J Street's positions are exactly. I mean, you certainly have a lot to say for yourself. I'm not denying it. This whole idea, though, which I want to say over and over again, that people have not been able to express themselves. I mean, what are we doing here tonight? What have we been doing for the last 40 years, those of us that have had? So if you want to keep saying it, do it. But you'll just be part of something that's been being said for 40 years, and it's never
Then
actually...
why was it such a big deal for you to invite me? Why is it the only invitation from a national Jewish organization that has come to J Street in a year was your one invitation? I have not been invited to one federation. When federations have asked me to speak, their leadership pressures them to disinvite me. When congregational rabbis want me to come and speak at a synagogue, they get pressure to disinvite me. Steve, you have got to get out more. This is real. This is what is happening, and people are applauding it because it is real within the American Jewish community. And until we come to terms with it, it threatens the American Jewish community. This is what is going to lead to the undermining of the very organizations we've had in this country for 50 to 100 years.
Steve,
You know
why
what,
do you
I'm gonna
think,
take- I'm
Steve,
gonna
why do
take
you think Tony Judd was uninvited to speak at the Polish embassy after being called by the ADL and the AJC? Was that a coincidence?
You know what? I'm
let me
going to take
tell
the
you
moderator's prerogative here to kind of slightly shift the subject. Let's stipulate, if we will, that some American Jews, we don't know exactly how many, but certainly some American Jews have felt that their voices have not been heard, and now they're having more of an opportunity for that to happen. And in any case, let's stipulate that Jews are continuing to vote Democratic and seem very much supportive of an administration that appears to be taking a very different point of view in the Mideast. So this is all a feature of democracy, right? Voting and expressing oneself and lobbying and all that. So there's also this other democracy there in Israel, and they seem to be going in quite the opposite direction. And the news today is saying that it looks like Avigdor Lieberman actually may be foreign minister in a new Netanyahu government. Let's put aside whether or not you think that's a good idea or not a good idea. It certainly is something that seems to be at odds with a great number of American Jewish public opinion. What do we do about this? What happens when people freely choose leaders with whom you believe, and I'm assuming most of you at least, are uncomfortable with the idea of say, somebody like a Lieberman being foreign minister? What happens? How do you, can you still support Israel and object to the government? But the government is elected by the people.
Well, of course you can. It's a simple answer. I mean, the vibrancy of the debate in Israel doesn't come to a stop because Avigdor Lieberman got 15 seats out of 120 in the Knesset. It's a very vibrant and open democracy. We have just as much right over here to criticize what Avigdor Lieberman ran on and stands for. And just as the folks who applauded that they're happy have the right to applaud that they're happy. I think that it is very vibrant, it is very healthy for American Jews to be able to express both of these opinions. And Steve, I apologize if by any way I am saying that I don't value those who disagree with me, because I actually value it greatly. And I think what we need is the recognition that there are differences of opinion among American Jews. It isn't one way or the other. There are people on the left, there are people in the center, and there are people on the right. Our communal organizations and those who purport to speak for the community, though, need to represent that range of opinions, and it needs to be acceptable to say that the things that Avigdor Lieberman stands for are completely at odds with what it means to be Jewish, in my opinion, and what it is to be democratic, in my opinion. Now, others may disagree with me, but we need to be able to have that discussion civilly, and I think that's what's really important for the American Jewish community, is to be able to have that discussion and be able to say we disagree in a civil manner.
I know we have certainly spoken out about Avigdor Lieberman's what he stands for, and I know AJC, American Jewish Committee, has fairly strongly in an editorial. I know the URJ, the Reform Movement, has fairly strongly. So it isn't as if there's some passive acceptance. Israel elected Lieberman, so therefore we're going to buy into this easily. I think that one thing is, if he gets that position, and I'm not 100% convinced he will, but if he were to get that position, we have to figure out how to deal and how to relate to the government with him in it and what he stands for. I don't find it simple, but I find it something we probably need to deal with and figure out, because those of us who are both pro-peace, Jeremy, and pro-Israel, we will have to deal with that government and figure out how to best work with it in one way or another.
But how do you also reconcile where public opinion there is going versus where public opinion here is going?
We've recently, I think it was 4 years ago, this country elected a government that was, also a pariah to the world, and also was, kind of a rebuke to the values of most of the people in the world. And it was always obvious to me, at least, that one needn't be anti-American by being, anti-Bush and being opposed to the foreign policy of the Bush administration. It seems just as simple to me that you can be, horrified by the political direction that's prevailing in Israel. You can be horrified by Netanyahu, and you can be even more horrified by Lieberman and still be supportive of Zionism. And I think that this pro-Israel, anti-Israel language, in a way, is confusing. I was just saying that I've been spending a lot of time with a kind of group of liberal Jewish students at UC Berkeley, about half of whom are Israeli, and so the idea for them of being pro-Israel or anti-Israel, it's a kind of meaningless distinction. They are pro, those parts of their country that represent their values, and they are against many others, and so. Yeah, again, I would say it's not so much about being, Israel right or wrong, or we support whatever Israel wants to do, which seems to me to be kind of the position of the mainstream Jewish community, as opposed to saying that we support, the kind of goals of Israel, we support Zionism, but actually I wish that our government would our government regularly pressures countries to adopt, kind of more amenable policies despite the democratic wishes of their people. And actually, I think that it's possible that the people in Israel maybe would not elect such figures if they felt that there was even a small diplomatic price to be paid in terms of United States support.
Do you think that way, Eric?
I don't know if I think that way. One of the touchiest words you can say when you're discussing Jews in Israel is the word dual loyalty. It's sort of one of those words that the official American Jewish officialdom has ruled out of the discourse. If you say dual loyalty, you're playing into the hands of anti-Semites, because it's been a consistent trope among anti-Semites that you can't trust Jews, et cetera, et cetera. And I find this very confusing, because I was raised dually loyal my whole life. When I went to Hebrew school, the content of my Hebrew school was all about supporting Israel. When my parents, who I think are here tonight, sent me to Israel when I was 14 on a ZOA-sponsored trip.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Another
Were they the
ZOA.
ones clapping?
Another ZOA.
I guess that didn't work.
That was
huh?
a bad idea, yeah. It was drummed into me that I should do what's best for Israel. I was at the Center for Jewish History not long ago, where I heard Ruth Weiss, the Yiddishist professor at Harvard, who happens to be the Martin L. Peretz professor of Yiddish. instruct a group of young Jewish journalists that they should think of themselves like as members of the Israeli army. That in Israel, young people had to serve in the army. Well, they didn't have to serve in the army, but they should think of themselves as members of a Jewish army, supporting the Jewish people, supporting Israel, putting aside their intellectual qualms and concerns about things like Lieberman. Now, it so happens that because so few people are willing to say this, and maybe, there's certainly good historical reason for this, I end up being quoted by Walt Mearsheimer as the only person who's saying, I am a duly loyal Jew, and sometimes I'm actually going to go with Israel, because the United States can take an awful lot of hits and come up standing, where if Israel takes one serious bad hit, it could disappear. So there's going to be some cases where, when Israel and the United States conflict, I'm going to support what's best for Israel rather than what I think is best for Israel. The big fiction that permeates virtually all discussion, and I bet you even in J Street, but certainly amongst all official organizations, is that there's no such thing that there could be possibly anything that could be both good for Israel and bad for the United States, or vice versa. Every single speech you go to at AIPAC or the AJC says, it's thank God that our interests and our values are perfectly aligned, and we support a strong Israel and we support a strong United States. No, that's not always going to be the case. They're two different countries with two different strategic interests and different points of view on certain things. And Lieberman, he's bad for everything as far as I understand the world. I mean, he's in the long term detrimental to Israel's interest, and he's certainly not in the United States' interest, which has a strong interest in maintaining peace and stability in that region. And so, in this case, there isn't really a conflict with my saying, look, if the Israelis want to elect a government that is detrimental to their interests, as I see it, and my own interests, I'm going to do everything I can to convince them to elect a different government, just the way the Palestinians elected a bad government by electing Hamas. Hamas is a democratically elected government. Hamas was an organization that was nurtured by the Israeli government itself. It was founded with a great deal of help from the Israeli security services. That turned out to be a really bad idea. Hamas is far more popular than Fatah is among Palestinians, according to the polls we read. That's too bad. Democracy is an important value, but it's not the only value. And so if the Israelis have made a terrible mistake, as many countries historically have made a terrible mistake, as a friend to Israel and a person who's concerned with the long-term health and happiness of the Jewish people, I'm going to say, I'm not going there with you guys. I have no problem doing that.
Can you imagine a time where you would feel that dual loyalty and go with Israel?
I just said there are many occasions when I can imagine.
Can you give us an example?
Off the top of my head? Well, look, to me, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is simple in the following regard. It's complicated in most regards, but it's simple in the following regard. There can only be peace. The only people who can deliver peace, who can deliver a state to the Palestinians, is the Israeli public. There isn't going to be, you can't force Israel to make peace against its will. And Israel will only make the concessions necessary for peace if they believe that the Palestinians are sincere about making peace. So I can see that saying to the Palestinian leadership, or saying to the Saudi leadership, or Egyptian leadership, so forth, look, we need to do a lot of unpopular things in Palestine to demonstrate to the Israeli public that the Palestinians have finally accepted their historic position and are now ready to make the peace that the Israelis can trust. Now, I'm not saying we're anywhere near that situation. I'm giving you a hypothetical. I'm answering your hypothetical question, and that might make the United States a great deal more unpopular in the Arab world. It might increase terrorism in the Arab world. I mean, I personally think, here's a much simpler example, actually. I think that bin Laden and 9/11 were to some degree inspired by United States support for Israel. I think a great deal of the terrorist attacks and the sort of pool of terrorists, potential terrorists, who want to attack the United States are inspired by United States support for Israel. I'm not saying we shouldn't support Israel for that reason. I'm saying, damn it, if that's the price we have to pay, then I'm willing to pay it. But I'm just saying, let's be honest about it. Let's not pretend that these things exist, that it's unimaginable that the two states could be in conflict. Because if these two states happen never to be in conflict, it would be the only time in history that ever happened. And yet we all treat it as if it's a given.
Steve, did you want to say anything?
A couple things. First of all, I don't think that mainstream Jewish organizations don't support the idea of dual loyalty, because that just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. I've never seen it, Eric said, in that way. That's why I'm looking in askance, because I don't know. We certainly don't have a policy like that. I can remember when I was a rabbi in St. Louis, and it was the first Rabbinical Association meeting, and we talked about flying the Israeli flag with the American flag, and some of the rabbis just went, "You can't do that." And I, of course, I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "It's dual loyalty." And I said, "Dual loyalty? Dual loyalty is a subject that we used to talk about as a bad thing 30 years ago. It's over. This is, 2004. We can fly both flags. It's okay to have dual loyalty." And I remember one rabbi said to me, "Well, what if the Palestinians want to fly an American flag and a Palestinian flag?" And I said, "Well, that would be good too. They have their own right to dual loyalty," which took them by surprise. But I guess my question is, I don't want to miss what I just said about Lieberman. David Harris and one of his assistants wrote a very strong op-ed in the New York Jewish Week, really castigating much of what Lieberman stands for, and in that sense, Lieberman. So I think it'd be wrong-headed to just ignore that, because that's actually right in our face in the last couple or 3 weeks. It was right there, right in print. And Jeremy, just to answer, because you asked me very directly, so I want to answer you directly. As far as I don't represent anyone but the JCPA, so I can't tell you about that. But I can say this. I can say that I don't know why J Street isn't included, but I do know that in several JCRCs, Brit Tzedek is on the JCRC, is actually a member of a Jewish Community Relations Council in different communities. I do know that as a rabbi in St. Louis, spoke at events in a synagogue with Brit Tzedek.
And Brit Tzedek is a separate organization.
It's a separate organization, but it's a organization considered on the liberal left side, however you want to say it, a grassroots organization. I know you work with them a lot. I think maybe it's a little bit of time. Maybe it's certain federations, I don't know. I can't answer that question as a whole. But as you said, I mean, the person you evinced the criticism to is someone who really happily invited you. And I don't know the answer to everything, because I'm not inside people's heads. I do know that in my experience, people talk a lot about every issue, and as you well know, there's mainstream organizations under us that have different views on settlement policy, different views on I don't know about Gaza. I'm trying to think if there were different views on Gaza, but certainly an open conversation is being had all the time, and I agree that there are times when we will be very opposed. I'm sorry about my voice; it's just going. It's not because I feel to the right here; just my voice. I do think that we'll differ with Israel at times, and I think that's okay. I mean, I think that's an okay thing to do.
So I'm going to now turn to some of the questions that you, the audience, have asked us. The first: should a liberal Israel lobby address the issue of Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal? Anybody want to take that?
No. Neither do I want to take it, nor should we address it.
And why not? The second, not the first.
Because we're not there yet. I mean, I was actually on a panel yesterday with somebody from the Israeli consulate in D.C., who I assume was speaking with the authority of the Israeli government, that that there's no question but that Israel supports the vision of a nuclear-free world one day, right? But until you get to that point, I just don't think we're not going to be discussing it for a long, long time.
Was it Augustine who said, "Make me virtuous, just not yet"?
Right. So I just don't think you want to go down that road just yet. No.
Anybody want to disagree with that?
It would be dumb. I mean, I think they should someday, but it would be dumb to do it today. Well, why be dumb?
Excuse me?
I'm just, you can always find, it would be easy to trip up J Street and say, if you believe in X, why don't you believe in Y? But the fact is that J Street, and I'm on the board of advisors, but I have nothing really to do with it. I just catch some flack on their behalf. Is the way it works. But the fact is that J Street is living in the real world, and they want to be effective, and they mean what they say when they say they want to be a effective and strategic and powerful voice for a significant portion of the Jewish community. We don't know exactly how large it is, but it's definitely significant. And for them to take positions that are purely on the basis of principle or on the basis of untethered morality would be contrary to what they exist for. So it's kind of a silly question in that respect, because Israel doesn't care what J Street thinks about their nuclear program, and nothing is going to change no matter what J Street thinks. So why get yourself in a situation like that?
So a number of the questions that we're hearing from the audience are wondering about the viability of a two-state solution, and especially how do you try to create something like that when so far, at least in many people's views, there's not a willing or able partner. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about how does a liberal lobby or a pro-peace movement or whatever push for this kind of two-state solution when so many people are saying that the window of opportunity for that is rapidly closing?
Right. I think that's the essential question. I think it's the urgency with which we created J Street. I think it's the immediacy that we feel about why we advocate so strongly for strong American intervention and leadership towards peace. It's because that opportunity is fading. The more that there is hopelessness and despair in Gaza, the more that there will be support for radicalism. The more that the settlement enterprise appears to be irreversible, the greater the support for terror. The more that it appears that you can't even create a Palestinian state on the West Bank any longer because it is so divided by roads and settlements and checkpoints, the more that you will have violence and conflict. And so the urgency is absolutely palpable. And I don't think that one can point to a moment when the window shuts on the two-state solution. So I think it's a bit academic to say, did it shut last week? Mm-hmm. Is it shutting in 3 weeks? I don't know. But I feel the urgency, but I still feel the possibility, because you still have majorities of the people on both sides of the conflict that actually want peace. And as long as you have that, we just need to create the political will for that to actually happen. When we lose that, we've probably lost the opportunity.
Michelle?
I think everybody knows that it's becoming ever more elusive, but the alternative to a two-state solution is Lieberman. Right? I mean, that's if you're not going to have a two-state solution, you're going to have then you're going to kind of lose any prospect of Israel as democracy. And so, even though there's no option. I mean, yes, it's becoming ever more impossible, but there is no other option save either. I mean, people on the left like to compare Israel to South Africa, and it's been mostly an invidious comparison, but it will become eventually a much more apt comparison. So you either have Israel an apartheid state, or Israel no longer a Jewish state, or it's like the last chance to save Israel. So even though it strikes me as being more difficult by the day, there's no other choice.
So one of the questions here asks, how about the fact that people might really genuinely feel fearful of being critical of Israel because of the worry of fueling anti-Semitism?
I do fuel anti-Semitism. I write things about Israel that turn up on anti-Semitic websites, and I see myself quoted on them, and it bothers me a great deal when I see it, and it happens all the time. You have to, there are no perfect choices in life as you become an adult. Life is a matter of available alternatives. And to me, the dangers that Jeremy and Michelle just described are far more significant to the Jewish people and to my values than are the dangers posed by anti-Semitism today. I think anti-Semitism is in most places, in most situations, of manageable proportions. In fact, it's at an all-time low in most Western countries. People talk about an enormous increase in anti-Semitism in Europe, but that's largely fueled by an increase of Islamic people in Europe. And it's not. If you go to France and you speak to French people, they're less anti-Semitic than historically French people have been. And certainly in this country, it's to me an insignificant problem. I think the ADL has kind of a racket going with all the money they raise. I picked up the Jewish Week a few weeks ago, and it said, and there was an ad for the ADL that said, "We will protect you." I'm like, from who? From who? I have a doorman. I don't need to. So it bothers me a great deal. I don't like these anti-Semites. But I think that we face much greater problems right now. And the problems are largely a matter of us not facing up to the dangers that Michelle and Jeremy just described.
Let me just respond for a second. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Eric, that one has to speak their truth if we're going to have truth, whether or not it creates some anti-Semitism or not. I do want to say that coming from Texas and living in Missouri, that there is a lot more anti-Semitism in parts of the country than one would think.
I think that's true. Yeah,
there is. I mean, the New York,
Oh, no.
that New York
More than in
doorman,
New York?
that New York doorman
doorman
thing
building.
probably ain't going to work in Texas. But with that said, I totally agree with you. In fact, I just had an experience like that where someone didn't want me to say something at the plenum because they said it's going to evoke anti-Semitism. I said, me. But I'm glad that the ADL does the work they do. Certainly in much of America. I just want to put myself in total agreement with everybody on the panel as far as the need to really push for a two-state solution. This is our moment, and the moments are fleeting. So if we don't push for a two-state solution now, I don't. There is no other obvious, clear path to me to a decent Middle East and a decent Israel and a decent. Palestinian state. So I think we have to. We can hide our heads and say it's not going to happen, but we have to really be pushing. Jews dream. We have to dream. We have to make this happen, and that's part of our job. It's part of the Israelis' job. It's part of the Palestinians' job. And as one of the three, I think it was Jeremy said, one of you said, vast majorities of both Israelis and Palestinians appear with the right conditions to want it. So it's as if we can help make those right conditions, that's a good thing.
So we mentioned before, I think a couple of times, the name Chas Freeman. Freeman, who sort of unceremoniously took himself out of running for a job in the Obama administration and blamed the Israel lobby. I don't want to rehearse with all of you what had happened. I think that's been chewed over plenty of times. But I do wonder about what you think the lasting effects this is going to give, especially maybe Jeremy, you can start talking in Washington because that's where you're based. And is this going to have some kind of consequence politically in the lobbying world?
I think it was a really, really ugly and unfortunate incident for all of us who care about the Jewish community in this country and all of us who care about Israel. I think that the way in which a nomination like that of a relatively mid to senior level bureaucratic appointment becomes a political football, and people immediately rush to their sides, and one side says, he's an Israel hater, he doesn't belong in that job, and all those who disagree with the people making those charges rush to the other side and say he's the best thing ever and he's our new hero. This is exactly what's wrong with the whole issue. I mean, J Street didn't take a position on Chas Freeman. We didn't have one. I'd never even heard of Chas Freeman before the whole debate started, and I think most of the people who criticized him and supported him had never heard of him, but they based their positions on who was opposing him or who was supporting him, and because they were on the other side, they immediately leaped in. So I think it was very bad, because at the end of the day, one group of people comes out of this saying, aha, you see, everything we ever thought about the conspiracy theories is right. Another group goes, aha, we won yet another battle. This is great. Our power is unassailed. I mean, I think it was a terrible incident. And I think the faster that we move beyond it and refocus back on what Steve said and what we've all said, the substance of this is what's important. If you care about Israel, then listen to what Steve just said. Listen to what we all said. If you care
Can't
about...
I be part of the week?
What? No, listen to us. I mean, listen to all of us. And I wish what Steve says was, in fact, what the main lobbyists for the Jewish community on the Hill were saying. Because if we actually did speak with the voice you just spoke with, Steve, then I think we'd have a whole different conversation. I think if you took a silent poll of 535 senators and members of Congress, and you asked them, does what you just said represent the view of the American Jewish organized community, you would get about 520 to 15 voting no, because that's not what they hear. And I love what you just said, and I think we're all in agreement on that. Let's move beyond Chaz Freeman. It just doesn't do us any good. Let's focus on what the work is that we need to get done.
I don't think we can move beyond. Do you want to go?
Well, the only thing I wanted to say is that you asked before about criticizing Israel, fomenting anti-Semitism. I actually think that this incredible taboos creates a fertile ground for anti-Semitism because people do feel that there's all of this stigmatized truth. There's all these things that they know to be true that they can't say. I think it makes them incredibly credulous about any claims about kind of Jewish power. It makes them much more susceptible to conspiracy theories, and the Chaz Freeman thing really buys into that. It's confirmation of everybody who ever kind of read Walt and Mearsheimer now feels, and believed everything they said, now feels completely vindicated. Anybody who's ever talked about, Jewish power, and then what's even worse is when you have someone like the AJC come out and say, well, that's just outrageous to say that the Israel lobby had anything to do with torpedoing Chaz Freeman. I mean, it's, honestly, are they going to insult our intelligence to that degree?
I think we need to talk about the Freeman example. I mean, we could talk about this issue in another way, some other way, but we talk about the issue. It's true, I never heard of Freeman before. And Freeman has pretty unexceptional views. He has the views of the typical sort of Arabist, unsentimentalist State Department person that George Ball had in the Kennedy and Johnson administration, and lots of State Department officials have, and James Baker kind of had. And he's not sentimental or particularly sympathetic to Israel, although I'm sure he probably thinks Israel should exist, and he probably has lots of Jewish friends. There's not a hint of anti-Semitism in his life. But Freeman's views are very unremarkable. They're not, aside from all of the emotional connection, they're not that different than mine, which is that Israel is on a negative path and it's not helping its own security, and that it's creating a lot of problems for itself and for the United States that would be better if it behaved differently. Now, what's most important to recognize about this, the torpedoing of his getting this job in the administration by the organized Jewish lobby and a group of neoconservative writers and bloggers who purport to speak for the American Jews, but again are equally unrepresentative, is that he was not appointed to a policy position. He was appointed to a position as an intelligence analyst. And so they were saying that we can't allow someone who has views that we find anathema in a position that has nothing to do with those views. Okay? It was his job to pass along the intelligence to his boss, who would then pass along to the president. Now, there's two possible interpretations that I can come up with why that's the case. One is that, well, the intelligence, this particular intelligence organization is going to decide what's up with Iran, and quite clearly, and despite everything they say, AIPAC wants a United States bombing of Iran's nuclear capability, and they were afraid that he might not give them the result they want, just as like they didn't get the result last time with the NIE. So they wanted to clear the way for somebody who was more sympathetic to their interpretation of Iran. That's one possible interpretation. The other impossible interpretation is that they understand that this position has nothing to do with policy, but that they needed to show the rest of the world that you're not allowed to hold these positions if you want your career to advance, and that they needed to take him out as a warning to everybody else. The same way when I first went to Washington in my early 20s, they took out Charles Percy, who was then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because they couldn't have, you weren't allowed to have a senator who, from Illinois at that point, but who had such an important role on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who called for an even-handed policy between Israel and the Palestinians. Now, again, it doesn't really matter what the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee thinks. It's a very weak committee. It wasn't really going to change anything. But AIPAC touted, when they did it, they touted their role in doing this. They basically put his head up on a pole. And it's the same thing that happened with Chaz Freeman. They put his head up on a pole and they said, we did this. There was a blogger, a Jewish blogger for the Weekly Standard named Michael Goldfarb, who accused Freeman of being the candidate of pedophiles. I'm not making that up. That's a quote, pedophiles. And I think AIPAC does this on purpose. They win ugly on purpose. I've been writing about AIPAC since I was in my 20s, and I'm not in my 20s anymore. And they like to win ugly. They like to win ugly because it intimidates people. And every time they win ugly, members of the Jewish community on the other side who lose, and other people, and you can read this in my friend M.J. Rosenberg's column this week, who writes for the Israel Policy Forum. He says, well, they've finally gone too far. They finally made so many enemies that it's going to be counterproductive, and they're inspiring a reaction against people who don't like to be pushed around. And then they come and do it again. Because there's nobody pushing from the direction. And that, whether even I agree with Jeremy or not, I happen to agree with him, but whether I agree with him or not, I think there's nothing more important for the ability of the American Jewish community to speak for its values and to help Israel just find its own values, and for the United States government to represent its own interests than have somebody pushing from the other side. Because as long as I've been an adult, there's just been one push, and it's come entirely from AIPAC. And if you wanted to stand against AIPAC, you were risking your seat. It happened to Percy. It happened to a lot of people down the line. And so it happens very rarely. And I know you're a smart guy, and I know you're telling the truth, but I can't believe you haven't been seeing this for the same 30 years that I've been seeing it. Because if you go to Congress, you know that it's just clear. There's just no percentage in going up against AIPAC.
So let me respond, because truth matters, and I want to make sure that my truth gets out. I am part of the organized Jewish community, and I know that some of the, Freeman was not just an unexceptional traditional guy. He actually has said that Israel was the root of the problem. That's serious. He said that, and this is a guy that is going to be analyzing intelligence. He said that the people rebelling at Tiananmen Square were, which upset Nancy Pelosi, the people rebelling were not doing the right thing because a country can't abide people rebelling. I mean, these are quotes.
He said exactly the same thing Henry Kissinger said.
Let me finish.
About
Let
him finish.
Let me finish. But let me talk about what I've just heard. I've heard three people who aren't really engaged in the center of the Jewish community saying something that, to me, who is engaged in the center of the Jewish community, doesn't ring true. And why doesn't it ring true? Because we were on the Hill. We were lobbying during that time. And not only did we absolutely tell those few people that wanted to lobby on Freeman that we were just not going to do it, that it's just not okay. I actually said we just don't know enough. I'm not about to do it, and I don't think it makes any sense. But I did talk to AIPAC, who very clearly said, we're not doing it. So the idea that someone's sitting here, and they talked to me. I mean, I'm not, they would certainly not want to withhold from us the right to do something if we were doing what they were doing. So it's like in a circle, something becomes a truth. And there's no proof of the truth, but why not just call it that, a truth? Well, AIPAC didn't do that. So all you can talk about is rumors, and you heard this and you heard that. I mean, certainly an ex-AIPAC employee did it, but he's suing AIPAC, so that's probably not a good example to use. So AIPAC you can attack. You got it after me, but you can attack it and attack it and attack it. But I certainly didn't see it in the Charles Freeman experience, and I certainly haven't seen it in my own life with AIPAC. I don't want to misstate it. I have seen pro-Israel people in elections go over the line and be beyond the line, but I've seen the same kind of narrowness and criticism, and you don't have a right to talk on the left and on the right all my life. And even though I come from the left, I can see it when I can call it when I see it. And right now I'm listening to three people. One who didn't take a stand, and I'm another one that didn't take a stand in organizations, and two that I guess didn't take a stand, I don't know, but saying something that to my understanding of reality, and I did investigate it, just didn't happen.
Two things. I want to clarify both what exactly I think is at stake in the Freeman matter, and also clarify something related to AIPAC. I think that there is something really important at stake with Freeman, and I think that what's at stake is this country can't afford to have a litmus test for public service that says you can't hold a mid to senior level position in the U.S. government if you have ever criticized Israel publicly. And if that's the lesson that comes out of this, if whoever is behind it succeeds in creating that kind of intimidation, that an administration won't appoint someone who in their writing or in their speaking has ever said critical things of Israel because they're afraid of the backlash, then we've really, really got a problem. And I think it would be very important for an organization like JCPA, which I know didn't take a position, and I applaud that, but I think for JCPA, for AIPAC, if they're not behind this, for others, to clarify that principle. Should there or should there not be this litmus test for public service? And I would argue that's a principle worth fighting for. I don't know Chaz Freeman. I don't know if he's worth fighting for or not. But the principle that you should be able to have that position, having criticized Israel, that's important
Chuck
to me.
Schumer did say that, by the way. He did say his positions were out of whack with regard to Israel, and that's why he helped.
Right, and so I think that's inappropriate.
Chuck Schumer can say what he wants.
Right, but I think it would be healthy for the voices of the American Jewish community, if they agree with me and us on this, to actually say so, and I haven't heard that. The second thing, just related to AIPAC, I want to second what Steve said, because I think this is going to sound strange coming from me at JSTRI, but I think AIPAC gets a bad rap. I think that they become the evil wizard behind the curtain for everything bad that goes on, and I think that what's important to understand in this particular fight, as is true in many, is that it was a wide range of actors. And the problem that I think we have in the Jewish community is not AIPAC. I think the problem that we have is a far bigger problem. I think it's a whole constellation of bloggers and groups and writers and people who purport to speak for the community. And in this case, AIPAC didn't necessarily publicly do this, and I think to blame them is a mistake. But I think they do get that, Steve, you're right. They do get the reputation, they get the bad rap for everything that goes on. I think that's incorrect. But the fact is that it was Steve Rosen who started this, a former AIPAC employee. It had nothing to do with AIPAC anymore. And it was then picked up by a chorus of right-wing organizations and bloggers who then took it to the Chuck Schumers and the Steve Israels and the others who were their go-to people on the Hill. And from there, the cat was out of the bag. So those are my two.
I wouldn't put my faith in supporting Charles Freeman. I don't know him well, and you may be right, Eric. He may be a perfectly wonderful guy. He doesn't seem like
I didn't call him wonderful.
No, I mean, I don't know. He may be a perfectly unexceptional guy, or he may.
Unexceptional.
But Samantha Power is a great example. I mean, it's easy to just, now we're going to use Charles Freeman, who we don't know of any Jewish organization that opposed, and we're going to use him to say what Jewish organizations do. And Samantha Power, who is, a wonderful person that's done a lot of great things on genocide, and I know because of my work with Darfur, there was nothing against her, and nobody said a word against Samantha, and yet.
Actually, she was the victim of a campaign. She was a victim of a campaign of character assassination by Commentary Magazine's blog. Commentary Magazine is not entirely independent of. We're not blaming AIPAC, but we're talking about the organized Jewish community and its.
Commentary Magazine is more normally a bunch of fairly neoconservative magazine that does what it does. Everyone's not so tied together. That's my point.
No one's talking about a conspiracy. We're talking about a magazine that was supported for 40 years by the American Jewish Committee, that is viewed quite legitimately as representative of American Jews, and is a very comfortable part of that constellation, which engaged in a campaign of character assassination against this person who you have chosen as an example.
She's an example because she did, because there was you want to use commentary. They didn't do very well. She's got a position, a very important position in the administration, and on the very first phone call and you had too, I guess, she was the person talking to the Jewish community. So, I mean, you just can, you can see it. It's easy. It's like, oh my God, there's this conspiracy, and we're all.
But none of us had said conspiracy. That's
how
you discredit.
Why would the administration have Samantha Power talking to the Jewish leadership from the right to the left if they were in any event concerned about this pressure? They're not. They're not. It didn't happen. It's just talk. I mean, it's easy to talk, but it's not happening.
Okay, so let's do this. Let's try to end the evening on an up note.
I could answer that, by the way, but I'm being polite.
Okay. So I'm just wondering if any of you have anything you'd like to share that might make you hopeful, whether it's this administration or something you've seen on a college campus or something that you're witnessing in your life. But I'm just wondering, as people who represent the liberal lobby or can speak about it, even if you don't like the term, what makes you hopeful?
Barack Obama as president makes me very hopeful. I am hopeful that he will follow through on his pledge to speak in a Muslim country within the first 100 days. Time is running on that. Maybe he'll extend the deadline. I hope that what he says there, he will have the courage to say the exact same thing in Israel. Because I think that the beauty of Barack Obama and the beauty of returning America to its role as a moral leader and a country that can take us to new heights in the global sense is that he is someone who I think can transcend differences. He's somebody who can inspire people of all races and religions and give renewed hope. So I am deeply hopeful in his ability to lead here and in the world, and I believe that his view of this conflict, he has spoken of his deep personal commitment to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and if he is serious about it, I think he has the wherewithal to do it, and I know that we at J Street look forward to supporting him in trying to do that.
Anybody want to add to that?
I'm also hopeful about Barack Obama, although not as hopeful as I once was about Barack Obama. But I'll say this. I wrote a long, very critical article about AIPAC in my early 20s, and it was a dumb thing to do from a strategic standpoint. And I didn't shy away from the issue, but I didn't focus on the issue as much as I would have liked to, given how strong my feelings are. And when I say AIPAC, I mean AIPAC, but there are other aspects to the problem. I don't share the view of the lobby, quote unquote, the way Walter Mearsheimer talk about it, but it's wrong. I don't want to focus on particularly on AIPAC. I do think there's a larger problem. But I would say now that that someone who was doing what I was doing 25 years ago would be a lot less lonely, that there's been a lot of space opened up. J Street is an example. It's both a cause and an effect of this space being opened up. It's a much different world than faced Brera or even the founders of Shalom Akshav and so forth. And I think that one is taking young people looking at the world and making the decisions have a much less threatening future should they decide to resist what has henceforth been, I think, a stifling attempt at conversation. But lest we be too hopeful, and I think the key to being Jewish is never to say anything good without saying something bad. We're really running out of time, and everything is moving in the wrong direction. I mean, the settlements are being expanded, and the Israeli government is growing more belligerent, and the Palestinian leadership is growing more belligerent and less realistic, and it's hard to imagine what kind of shock is going to bring people to their senses in time. I mean, it's tragic and painful to recognize that we actually pretty much know what the contours of the solution are. There's pretty much agreement by people on what solutions are, and yet nobody can figure out how to get there. But in the interim, as we're not figuring out how to get there, there are a lot of wheels that are making everything far worse and far more difficult. And we've been seeing this happening now for 20, 30 years, and we knew it was happening, and yet it still happens. And this just scares and depresses the hell out of me.
Michelle?
Well, I would say what makes me hopeful is this project. I've been working on a research project looking at both anti-Semitism on college campuses and kind of false accusations of anti-Semitism that have been used to intimidate various professors and student groups, often on the same campuses. And you have the two things going on simultaneously and are sometimes difficult to disentangle. But I was in California last week actually expecting to find, I don't really have any illusions that just because there are false accusations of anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism doesn't also exist. And I really thought I was going to find it, especially at UC Irvine, which is, rumored to be this kind of hotbed. And instead what I found, especially at Berkeley and also to a degree at UC Irvine, was the students making incredible efforts to have some kind of a dialogue with each other. At UC Berkeley, there are very close relationships between a group called Kesher Anoshi, which means the human connection, and it's one of the larger Jewish student groups on campus, and they have very close relationships with a lot of the kids in Students for Justice in Palestine. There are many Jewish students in Students for Justice in Palestine. You have, in the community, and people keep talking about the community, a real effort to create a more adversarial situation. They're constantly accusing Hillel of being anti-Israel, which kind of shows you how preposterous this argument is getting. But despite the kind of lack of support on both sides, there's these kids are kind of on their own forging real bonds and doing real work to coexistence. And even at UC Irvine, which again, if you Google UC Irvine and anti-Semitism, you would think it's like Kristallnacht every night there, when in fact you had, just last year, a group of Jewish students and Muslim students and Christian students go to Israel together, and they have this group called the Olive Tree Initiative. They're doing, they're doing much better than the news would have us believe. There's much more common ground there than is immediately apparent.
Well, thank you. Steve?
I think that what gives me hope, and this is a microcosm of that hope, is the civility that was shown here tonight in this panel. Because I feared a little bit, but it was not warranted. No, and I think that if this community, the American Jewish community, we only have a minor role to play, really, in peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but we need to play it as well as we can, and we all will probably take different parts of that role, and we'll talk about it differently. But I think we need, those of us that really do want to see a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, need to find ways to help each other when we can, oppose each other when we can't. We don't need to worry that we'll be doing it in different ways and we'll be saying different things. But the civility tonight gives me hope that we can do the best we can. It's really an Israeli problem and a Palestinian problem. I don't think we can solve it here in this country, but we can do our best. And I have some hope just listening to all 4 or 5 of us, that we can move that agenda ahead.
Well, thank you, Eric Alterman, Michelle Goldberg, Steve Gutow, Jeremy Ben-Ami. Please join me in thanking them for a most civil and exciting conversation.